king forced the prince to marry a humble farmer to punish him. However, he was stunned by what his son did. The great hall of Westland Palace fell silent as Prince Nathaniel stormed in, his boots echoing against the marble floor. The afternoon sun streamed through stained glass windows, casting colorful shadows across the faces of startled courtiers who parted before him like a sea at the far end of the hall. King James looked up from a map-covered table, his weathered face hardening at the sight of his son. "Father," Nathaniel called out, his voice carrying across the hushed chamber. "I need to speak with you privately." The king's eyes narrowed. "Whatever you have to say can be said here, before the court that you will one day rule." He gestured dismissively at the assembled nobles. "If you can find the courage to rule at all." A muscle twitched in Nathaniel's jaw. At 30, he had his father's height and his mother's softer features, a combination that made him beloved by the kingdom's eligible noblewomen. But today, there was nothing soft in his expression. "Very well," he said, climbing the 3 steps to the royal dais. "I will not marry Princess Eleanor of Eastshore." The whispers began immediately, rippling through the court like wind through summer wheat. King James remained stone-faced, though a dangerous flush crept up his neck. "You dishonor yourself," the king said quietly. "And you dishonor Westland. The alliance with Eastshore has been negotiated for 3 years." "I'm well aware," Nathaniel replied. "I've endured every tedious meeting, but I will not bind myself to a woman I cannot love, for a political advantage we do not need." From a shadowed archway to the right of the throne, Queen Genevieve watched with calculating eyes. 20 years younger than her husband, her beauty remained unmarked by the birth of her infant son 6 months earlier. The prince's rebellion was an unexpected gift. Every moment Nathaniel defied his father was another step toward her own son's ascension. "Love?" King James spat the word. "You speak of love as if you were a common farmer instead of the heir to Westland. Tell me, my son, does this defiance have anything to do with your frequent visits to Duke Montgomery's estate?" Nathaniel's face paled. "Your guards are not as discreet as you might hope," the king continued. "Nor is Lady Montgomery's daughter as careful as nobility should be." A new wave of whispers swept the hall. Duchess Montgomery, standing near a column with her husband, grabbed her husband's arm to steady herself. "Leave Catherine out of this," Nathaniel said, his voice dangerously low. The king rose from his throne, suddenly looking every inch the conqueror who had expanded Westland's borders through 20 years of strategic warfare and marriage alliances. "Catherine," he said, savoring the name like a weapon. "So familiar with the Duke's daughter. Tell me, son, have you compromised the lady's virtue while breaking your word to Eastshore?" The room's temperature seemed to drop. Duke Montgomery stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively to where his sword would hang had they been allowed in the king's presence. "Your Majesty," the Duke said, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage, "my daughter's honor is no longer your concern," the king cut in. "Guards, bring in Lady Catherine!" The massive doors swung open, and 2 royal guards escorted in a young woman with copper hair and tear-stained cheeks. She wore a simple riding dress, suggesting she'd been intercepted while attempting to flee. "Catherine!" Nathaniel moved toward her, but guards stepped between them. King James descended the 3 steps slowly, deliberately, savoring the moment. "Duke Montgomery, you have been a loyal commander of my armies. Your strategic mind has won us many victories, so I will offer you this mercy. Your daughter will not be punished for seducing my son." "Father, she did not," Nathaniel began. "Silence," the king thundered. "You have broken faith with Eastshore, embarrassed your kingdom, and betrayed my trust. There will be consequences." He turned back to Duke Montgomery. "Your daughter will be sent to the Western convent until a suitable marriage can be arranged, perhaps a widower from the northern provinces." Catherine let out a small sob. "And you, my son," the king continued, turning to Nathaniel, "you still require a wife. If a princess is not to your liking, perhaps a lesson in humility will serve you better." A cruel smile played at his lips. "Captain," he called to the guard commander, "send men to the poorest farming village in the kingdom. Find the most common, unremarkable peasant girl, and bring her here. My son shall have his bride." Gasps echoed throughout the hall. Even Queen Genevieve straightened in surprise, her perfect features arranged in a mask of concern that did not reach her eyes. This was better than she could have hoped. "You cannot be serious," Nathaniel said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "Oh, but I am," the king replied. "You reject a princess for love. Then let us see how you love when paired with the dirt of our kingdom. The wedding will take place 1 week from today." Catherine broke free from her guards and ran to Nathaniel. "I'm sorry," she whispered as she reached him, their fingers touching briefly before the guards pulled them apart. "I should never have—" "Take her away," the king ordered, "and prepare the prince's chambers for his new bride." As Catherine was dragged from the hall, Nathaniel faced his father. "This cruelty will not stand. The people will not accept." "The people," King James said, "will accept whatever their king commands, as will you." He returned to his throne. "The court is dismissed, Prince Nathaniel. You are confined to your quarters until your wedding day." As guards surrounded the prince, Duchess Montgomery collapsed in her husband's arms. The duke's face had gone from rage to ashen despair, knowing that opposing the king's will would mean the end of his family's position, possibly their lives. In the shadowed archway, Queen Genevieve slipped away silently, a faint smile playing at her lips. In her private chambers, her infant son slept peacefully, unaware that his path to the throne had just become clearer. And in a small apple orchard many miles away, a young woman named Abigail Foster worked under the afternoon sun, completely unaware that her life was about to change forever. Dawn broke over the eastern hills, bathing the small apple orchard in gentle golden light. Abigail Foster had been awake for an hour already, her calloused hands working methodically to repair a broken fence post. At 22, she had the practiced movements of someone who had worked the land her entire life. Her dark hair was tied back in a simple braid, wisps escaping to frame a face that was pretty without being remarkable. Except for her eyes, they were an unusual shade of blue-gray that seemed to change with her moods, currently narrowed in concentration. "There," she murmured to herself, stepping back to examine her work. The repaired fence would keep the neighbors' goats from wandering into her orchard again. Not that there was much to steal this early in the season. The apple blossoms had only just given way to tiny green fruit that wouldn't be ready for months. The small cottage at the edge of the orchard had been her home for as long as she could remember. Thomas and Mary Foster had found her as an infant. They told her, wrapped in a fine blanket with nothing but a strange medallion clutched in her tiny hand. They had raised her as their own, teaching her everything they knew about apple farming and keeping the mystery of her origins between the three of them. Now they were both gone. Thomas to a winter fever 3 years ago. Mary following her husband just last autumn. Abigail was alone, running the orchard by herself, stubbornly refusing the marriage proposals that would have made her life easier, but would have meant surrendering her independence. She touched the medallion that hung from a leather cord around her neck. It was her only link to whatever came before the Fosters. A silver disc, etched with an intricate tree symbol surrounded by strange markings she couldn't decipher. She'd shown it once to the village schoolmaster, who had examined it with great interest before telling her it might be a family crest, though not one he recognized. "Whoever left you with this wanted you to know where you came from," he had said. "Perhaps someday you'll find answers." Abigail tucked the medallion back beneath her simple cotton shirt. Someday, for now, there were trees to tend and barely enough money to pay the king's taxes. Dreams of discovering her origins would have to wait. She gathered her tools and headed toward the cottage for breakfast, when the sound of approaching horses made her pause. Visitors were rare in this remote corner of Westland. The nearest village was 5 miles away, and few travelers ventured this far from the main road. 4 horses appeared around the bend in the road, their riders wearing the distinctive blue and silver uniforms of the Royal Guard. Abigail's heart quickened. Royal Guards never brought good news to common folk. "Miss Foster," called the lead rider as they approached. Abigail gripped her hammer tighter. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "I'm Abigail Foster." The guard dismounted, removing his helmet to reveal a weather-beaten face with kind eyes that contrasted with his formal tone. "By order of His Majesty King James, you are to come with us to the Royal Palace immediately." Abigail stared at him in disbelief. "There must be some mistake. I've done nothing wrong." "No mistake, miss," the guard said, glancing uncomfortably at his companions. "His Majesty has selected you." "Selected me? For what purpose?" Panic edged into her voice. Everyone knew the king's reputation. His conquests weren't limited to neighboring kingdoms. "I'm not at liberty to say," the guard replied. "Only that you're to come with us now. You may bring 1 bag of personal belongings." Abigail looked around desperately. The nearest neighbor was too far to call for help. And even if they weren't, who would dare defy the king's guards? "How long will I be gone?" she asked. Stalling for time, the guard's expression softened slightly. "Miss Foster, I suggest you pack as though you won't be returning." A chill ran through her. "My orchard will be tended to," another guard interrupted impatiently. "The king has generously arranged for compensation to be paid to your family." "I have no family," Abigail said, lifting her chin. "This orchard is all I have." The kind-eyed guard sighed. "Then the compensation will await your return. Should that come to pass, please, miss, don't make this difficult. We have our orders." Abigail recognized the futility of resistance. 4 armed royal guards against 1 woman with a hammer. There was no contest. Besides, refusing a royal summons was treason, punishable by death. "May I at least change my clothes?" she asked, gesturing to her dirt-stained work clothes. The guard nodded. Quickly, inside her small cottage, Abigail moved in a daze. What could the king possibly want with her? She had never been to the capital, let alone the palace. She owned nothing of value except the orchard itself. Her hands trembled as she packed a small leather bag with her few possessions: a change of clothes, her mother's hairbrush, a small knife that had belonged to her father, and a miniature wooden apple he had carved for her on her 16th birthday. As an afterthought, she added the book of folk tales her mother had read to her as a child. One of the few books they owned, she changed into her best dress, a simple blue garment that Mary had sewn for her before she died. It wasn't fancy by any standard, but it was clean and whole, the medallion she kept hidden beneath it, unwilling to reveal her one treasure to these strangers. When she emerged from the cottage, the guards were waiting impatiently. The leader held the reins of a 5th horse, a gentle-looking mare clearly brought for her. "I don't know how to ride," Abigail admitted, embarrassed. "You'll learn," he replied, helping her awkwardly into the saddle. "It's a 3-day journey to the capital." As they rode away, Abigail twisted in the saddle for one last look at her home. The morning sun now fully illuminated the small cottage and the neat rows of apple trees stretching up the hillside. A lump formed in her throat as she wondered if she would ever see it again. The journey passed in a blur of unfamiliar landscapes and uncomfortable nights at rural inns, where the guards kept her under constant watch. They were not unkind, but neither would they answer her increasingly desperate questions about why she had been summoned. By the 3rd day, the rolling farmland gave way to more populated areas. Villages became towns. And finally, as the sun began to set, the gleaming spires of the capital city appeared on the horizon. "Welcome to Westland City, Miss Foster," said the lead guard, noting her wide-eyed expression. Abigail had never seen so many buildings, so many people. The streets were crowded with merchants, nobles in fine carriages, and commoners going about their business, and towering above it all was the royal palace, a massive structure of white stone and glittering windows that seemed to touch the clouds. As they rode through the imposing palace gates, Abigail's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Whatever fate awaited her inside those walls, she sensed that her life would never be the same again. The palace servants descended upon Abigail like a flock of birds, whisking her through marble corridors and up winding staircases. Her protests went unheeded as they stripped away her simple blue dress, scrubbed her skin raw in a copper tub, and attacked her hair with brushes and combs. "What is happening?" she demanded for the 10th time as they forced her into an elaborate gown of pale green silk. The garment, while beautiful, felt like a costume, too fine, too delicate for a woman who spent her days tending apple trees. "You're to be presented to the king within the hour," replied an older servant, securing silver pins into Abigail's dark hair. "It's not our place to say more." "But why me? There must be some mistake." Abigail's voice cracked with frustration. The servants exchanged glances but said nothing. One younger girl looked at her with something like pity, before quickly averting her gaze. A knock at the door silenced the room. A stern-faced woman entered, her elaborate black gown and rigid posture marking her as someone of authority. "I am Lady Harwick, mistress of the royal household," she announced, inspecting Abigail with critical eyes. "You are the foster girl." "Yes," Abigail answered, lifting her chin. "And I demand to know why I've been brought here against my will." Lady Harwick's thin lips curved into something resembling a smile. Such spirit! How quaint! She circled Abigail slowly. I suppose you'll do, though heaven knows what His Majesty is thinking. Thinking about what? Abigail pressed. You truly don't know. Lady Harwick seemed genuinely surprised. You are to be married today. The room spun around Abigail. Married? To whom? To Prince Nathaniel, of course. Lady Harwick said it as if announcing Abigail would be cleaning chamber pots. The heir to the throne of Westland. Abigail laughed. A sharp, disbelieving sound that made the servant stare. That's absurd. Princes don't marry orchard girls. Indeed they don't. Lady Harwick agreed coldly. Not willingly, at least. This is a punishment. For him primarily, though I expect it will be unpleasant for you as well. Now come, His Majesty awaits. Before Abigail could protest further, she was ushered through more corridors, finally arriving at a pair of massive doors flanked by guards. Beyond them lay the throne room, a cavernous space where dozens of elaborately dressed nobles stood in small clusters, whispering behind jeweled hands and painted fans, every eye turned to her as she entered. Abigail felt their stares like physical touches, some curious, most disdainful. At the far end of the room, atop a raised dais, sat King James on his throne of gold and ivory. Beside him stood a younger man, who could only be Prince Nathaniel, his handsome face set in rigid lines of controlled anger. "Approach," commanded the king, his voice echoing across the marble floor. Lady Harwick propelled Abigail forward with a firm hand on her back. The walk seemed endless, each step on the polished floor unnaturally loud in the hushed room. When she finally stood before the dais, Abigail curtsied awkwardly, nearly losing her balance in the unfamiliar silk slippers. "So," said King James, leaning forward to study her, "this is the peasant they found. What is your name, girl?" "Abigail Foster, Your Majesty," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. "And what do you do, Abigail Foster?" "I tend an apple orchard." "Sire, it was my parents before they died." The king's mouth quirked. "An apple farmer. How delightfully common." He turned to his son. "What say you, Nathaniel? Is she not a fitting bride for a prince who rejects royal alliances?" Prince Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his eyes deliberately avoiding Abigail. The king laughed, a sound without warmth. "Silence now. Where is the defiance you showed days ago?" He returned his attention to Abigail. "My son has dishonored this kingdom by breaking his betrothal to Princess Eleanor of Eastshore. As punishment, he will marry you instead. A lesson in obedience and duty." Understanding dawned on Abigail with sickening clarity. She was not here as a bride, but as a tool of humiliation. "With respect, Your Majesty," she said, finding courage in her rising anger. "I am not an object to be used for punishment." A collective gasp rippled through the court. The prince's eyes snapped to her face, showing the first flicker of interest. King James stared at her, his expression somewhere between amusement and disbelief. "You dare speak to me thus?" "I dare speak the truth," Abigail replied, her heart hammering against her ribs. "If you wish to punish your son, do so. But I have done nothing to deserve being torn from my home and forced into marriage." Silence fell over the throne room. The nobles seemed to hold their collective breath, waiting for the king's wrath to descend. Instead, King James laughed again, a genuine laugh this time. "By the gods, she has more spine than half my court." He rose from his throne and descended the steps until he stood directly before Abigail. "Listen carefully, Apple Girl. You will marry my son today. In return, your orchard will receive royal protection and a generous stipend. Refuse, and I will have it burned to the ground before sunset." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. "You would destroy a farm that feeds your people over a petty royal dispute." The king's face hardened. "I would destroy far more than that to ensure the respect of my son and my subjects. Do not test me." From a side entrance, a woman glided into the throne room. Her beauty was undeniable. Skin like polished ivory, golden hair arranged in an elaborate style, and a gown of midnight blue that emphasized her slender waist. A small silver crown marked her as Queen Genevieve, the king's young wife. "My dear," she called sweetly, "is this the bride? How? Rustic?" Her gaze raked over Abigail with thinly veiled contempt. Though I'm sure with proper training, she might learn not to embarrass the royal family completely. Prince Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Let's get this farce over with, Father. The longer we delay, the more you undermine our standing with East Shore." "Ever practical, my son," King James replied. "Very well. The bishop awaits in the chapel." What followed was a blur of movement and ritual. Abigail found herself in a small chapel adorned with golden candelabras and stained glass windows depicting the conquest of Westland. A wizened bishop in ornate robes stood before an altar, surrounded by stern-faced nobles who seemed more like witnesses to an execution than wedding guests. Prince Nathaniel stood beside her, rigid and distant when prompted to take her hand. His touch was cold and impersonal. The traditional vows felt like lies in their mouths, promises of honor and cherishing exchanged between strangers bound by royal decree rather than affection. When the prince was instructed to kiss his bride, he barely brushed his lips against hers, a gesture of technical compliance rather than emotion. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," intoned the bishop. "May your union bring forth heirs to secure the royal line of Westland." As they processed out of the chapel, now Prince and Princess of Westland, Abigail caught sight of Queen Genevieve watching from the shadows, her beautiful face twisted with calculation rather than the customary joy of a royal wedding. That night, alone in an opulent chamber while her new husband was conspicuously elsewhere, Abigail clutched her medallion and wept for the simple life that had been stolen from her, and for the loveless future that stretched before her like a prison sentence. A week passed, then another. Abigail barely saw her husband. Prince Nathaniel had established their relationship with brutal efficiency the morning after their wedding. "Let me be clear," he had said, standing stiffly by the window of her chambers. "This marriage is a punishment. Nothing more. You will be given an allowance and treated with the courtesy due your title. In return, you will remain out of my way." He had assigned her chambers in the palace's east wing, far from his own. Now, Abigail's days stretched before her in empty sameness. She wandered the vast corridors like a ghost, trailed by two ladies' maids who seemed more like guards than companions on this particular evening. Her restlessness reached a breaking point. After her maids retired for the night, she slipped from her chambers, driven by an impulse to explore the sleeping palace. The marble halls echoed with her soft footsteps as she ventured into unexplored wings. After several wrong turns, Abigail found herself before massive oak doors carved with intricate patterns. Curiosity overcame caution, and she pushed one open to reveal the royal library, a vast chamber with shelves stretching 3 stories high, filled with more books than she had ever imagined could exist. She stepped inside, overwhelmed by the smell of leather bindings and old parchment. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. For the first time since arriving at the palace, Abigail felt something other than dread, a spark of wonder. At her parents' small cottage, books had been precious rarities. She had learned basic reading from her mother and the village schoolmaster, but never had she seen such a collection of knowledge. Abigail approached the nearest shelf, running her fingers over the spines. She selected a volume bound in blue leather and carried it to a reading table where a few candles still burned low. Opening it revealed dense text in an ornate script and illustrations of unfamiliar plants. "That's a treatise on botanical specimens from the Eastern Isles," said a voice from the shadows. "Hardly light reading for midnight wanderings." Abigail nearly dropped the book. Prince Nathaniel emerged from between 2 towering bookshelves, a volume in his own hand. "Your Highness," she stammered, rising quickly. "I apologize for the intrusion. These are your chambers as much as mine now," he replied dryly. "Though I admit I'm surprised to find you here. I wouldn't have expected an orchard girl to have literary interests." The condescension in his tone ignited a familiar spark of defiance. "We orchard girls do occasionally engage with the written word," she replied. "Though typically after our days of manual labor, something I suspect you know little about." Instead of anger, a flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Touché." He moved closer, examining the book she'd chosen. "Can you actually read this?" "Some words," she admitted reluctantly. "My mother taught me basics, but..." She gestured helplessly at the complex text. "This is beyond my skills." An unexpected emotion, something like sympathy, softened his expression momentarily. "What brings you to the library if not to read?" Abigail shrugged. "Boredom, loneliness." She met his eyes directly. Your palace is grand but hardly welcoming. Nathaniel studied her, as if seeing her properly for the first time. No, I suppose it isn't. He placed his book on the table and pulled out a chair across from her. So, you can read a little. Yes, and I'd like to learn more, she added boldly. Since it appears I'll be imprisoned here indefinitely, I might as well improve my mind. Imprisoned? His eyebrows rose. You live in a palace, wear silk, and want for nothing. Except freedom, Abigail countered. Except purpose? I've worked every day since I was old enough to carry a basket. Now I'm expected to simply exist, like a decorative vase. Nathaniel leaned back, regarding her thoughtfully. You're not what I expected. And what did you expect? Someone dazzled by wealth. Someone grateful for the elevation in status. However it came about, his mouth quirked in a half-smile. Not someone who would compare royal life to imprisonment. I never asked for elevation, Abigail said softly. I was content with my orchard. A brief silence fell between them. Do you miss her very much? Abigail asked suddenly. Who? The woman you defied your father for? She must be remarkable to be worth all this. Nathaniel's face closed like a shutter. Lady Catherine is not your concern. She's the reason I'm here, Abigail pointed out. That makes her very much my concern. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture that made him appear younger, less imperial. Catherine and we grew up together. Her father and mine were close allies before, he trailed off. We thought we loved each other. Perhaps we did. And now she's in a convent in the Western province, and I'm married to you. His voice was bitter. My father's lesson in obedience is complete. Not quite, Abigail observed quietly. You're still avoiding your wife. His eyes snapped to hers, surprise evident. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his face. You really aren't at all what I expected, Abigail Foster. It's Princess Abigail now, according to that ceremony, she reminded him with a wry smile. So it is. He glanced at the book before her. Would you like to learn? To read properly? I mean, the offer caught her by surprise. You would teach me. I have tutors who could do a better job, he replied. But yes, I could help, consider it. Reparations for your stolen freedom. Why would you bother? Nathaniel considered this. Perhaps because you're the first person in this palace to speak to me as a man rather than a prince. He stood, selecting a different book from a nearby shelf. This one might be more suitable for beginning. He placed a slimmer volume before her, bound in green leather with gold lettering, Fables and Tales of Westland, opening to the first page. He pointed to a simple illustration of a fox. Can you read this passage? Abigail bent over the book, carefully sounding out the words, the clever fox, who wished to be king, Nathaniel supplied when she hesitated. King found that wearing a crown did not make him. She paused again. Wise, he finished. The clever fox who wished to be king found that wearing a crown did not make him wise. His eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them. Perhaps a fitting beginning. The candlelight cast warm shadows across his face, softening the proud features. For a moment, Abigail glimpsed the man beneath the prince. Someone thoughtful, possibly even kind. You're not the tyrant I imagined, she said quietly. And what did you imagine? Someone like your father, cold, calculating. Nathaniel's expression darkened. We're more alike than I care to admit. He closed the book. It's late. The servants will talk if we're discovered here alone. Would that matter? We are married, after all. Everything matters in the palace, Princess Abigail. Every word, every glance is currency in a never-ending game of power. He rose to leave, then hesitated. If you wish to continue your studies, I can arrange for books to be sent to your chambers. Less conspicuous than midnight meetings. Thank you, Abigail said, surprised by his consideration. But I think I prefer the library. It's the only place that feels alive in this mausoleum. Nathaniel paused at her words. You're not entirely wrong. This palace has not been truly alive for many years. He bowed slightly. Good night, Princess. Good night, Prince Nathaniel. She replied formally, but added as he turned to leave. Or should I simply call you husband when we're alone? He looked back, his expression unreadable. Let's master reading before we tackle the complexities of our arrangement. Shall we? After he departed, Abigail remained in the library, turning the pages of the fable book. The tale of the Fox King continued. Despite his crown, the animals of the forest gradually lost respect for him, for they saw that his wisdom was only clever tricks disguised as leadership from her shadowed alcove near the library entrance. Queen Genevieve watched the unlikely pair with narrowed eyes. The easy conversation between her stepson and his peasant bride was an unexpected complication. After a moment's consideration, she slipped away to her chambers where her trusted advisor and lover, Duke Bradford, awaited her latest report. The prince grows fond of his punishment bride, she would tell him. We must ensure this budding connection withers before it bears fruit. Queen Genevieve's private chambers glowed with candlelight, casting long shadows across the ornate furnishings. Duke Bradford lounged in a velvet chair, swirling wine in a crystal goblet as the queen paced before him. The peasant girl grows too comfortable, she said, her beautiful face tight with irritation. And Nathaniel seems increasingly intrigued by her. Hardly surprising, Bradford remarked. She's a novelty, plain but spirited. Men tire quickly of such diversions. I can't afford to wait for his interest to wane, Genevieve snapped. My son must be named heir before the king's health deteriorates further. Bradford raised an eyebrow. The king seems robust enough. His physician tells a different story. She lowered her voice. Heart weakness. It could be years or months. She stopped before a gilded mirror, adjusting her golden hair. If Nathaniel remains in favor when James dies, my son will never see the throne. Then we must ensure Nathaniel falls from grace, Bradford said simply. Or perhaps the new princess could meet with an unfortunate accident. Genevieve turned, her eyes calculating. Not yet. The court already whispers about my ambitions. An obvious move would be dangerous, she resumed, pacing. We need to understand this girl better. What secrets might she harbor? Allow me, Bradford offered. I have my methods of extracting information. Begin with her quarters, Genevieve instructed. Search while she's occupied elsewhere. Later that afternoon, while Abigail attended her first official court function, Duke Bradford slipped into her chambers, dismissing the servants with a royal decree. He moved methodically through her possessions, few enough to search quickly. Inside her wooden chest, beneath simple garments, he found a small leather bag. Opening it revealed little of interest. A worn brush, a whittled wooden apple, a book of folk tales. He was about to abandon his search when his fingers brushed against something metal. The medallion gleamed dully in the afternoon light. Bradford turned it over, studying the intricate design. A stylized tree surrounded by ancient script. His blood ran cold as recognition dawned. Impossible, he whispered. He pocketed the medallion and left swiftly, his mind racing with implications and memories he'd long suppressed. Where exactly are you taking me? Abigail asked, hurrying to keep pace with Prince Nathaniel as they descended a spiral staircase. To see Westland as it truly is, he replied, his voice echoing in the narrow passageway. Not the polished version presented at court. 3 weeks after their midnight meeting in the library, Nathaniel had begun appearing regularly at Abigail's chambers, first with books, later with invitations to walk the palace grounds. Today's excursion was different, more secretive. They emerged in a small courtyard where 2 horses waited, attended by a single groom who bowed deeply. Can you ride yet? Nathaniel asked. Your riding master says I'm a quick study, Abigail replied, approaching the smaller mare with newfound confidence. Though I suspect he's being charitable, Nathaniel smiled, a gesture that transformed his serious face. Garrison never offers false praise. If he says you can ride, you can ride. Soon they were trotting through a hidden gate in the palace wall, accompanied by only 2 plainclothes guards who kept a discreet distance. Is this wise? Abigail asked as they entered the city proper. Shouldn't the crown prince have more protection? Sometimes security lies in anonymity, Nathaniel replied, gesturing to their simple clothing. Few recognize me without royal trappings. The capital unfolded before them. Not the stately boulevards near the palace, but narrow streets packed with ordinary citizens. Shopkeepers haggled with customers, children darted between market stalls, and laborers carried heavy loads. The sights, sounds, and smells reminded Abigail of village market days, though on a vastly larger scale. "Why show me this?" she asked as they dismounted near a busy square. "Because this is the kingdom I'll inherit," Nathaniel answered, his eyes following a group of thin children playing near a fountain. Not the gilded halls and ceremonial duties, but these people and their daily struggles. They walked through the market, stopping occasionally as Nathaniel spoke with vendors and craftsmen. Abigail noticed how differently he carried himself here, less rigid, more attentive. The people, unaware of his identity, spoke freely about taxes, grain shortages, and the king's latest military campaign. They suffer while the court feasts, Abigail observed quietly as they passed a line of women waiting for the baker's day-old bread. "Yes," Nathaniel agreed grimly. "My father believes a kingdom's strength lies in its military might and noble alliances. I've come to think differently. Is that why he punished you? Because you questioned his values?" Nathaniel glanced at her sharply. "You're perceptive." He guided her toward a quieter street. "The marriage to Princess Eleanor would have secured ships and timber from East Shore, resources for more conquests. When I refused, I challenged not just his authority, but his vision for Westland." "And your vision?" Abigail asked, before he could answer. Commotion erupted nearby. A market guard had seized a young boy clutching a loaf of bread. "Thief!" the guard shouted, twisting the child's arm painfully. Without hesitation, Nathaniel strode forward. "Release him," he commanded. The guard sneered. "Mind your own business unless you want trouble." Nathaniel straightened to his full height, his voice taking on the unmistakable tone of authority. "I said release him." Something in his bearing made the guard hesitate. The prince pulled a gold coin from his pocket, worth 20 times the bread's value. "For the baker," he said, placing it in the guard's hand. "And this," he added a second coin, "for you to forget this incident." The guard's eyes widened at the unexpected wealth. He released the boy, who darted behind Abigail. "Thank you, sir," the child whispered, gazing up at Nathaniel with awe. "Hunger isn't a crime," Nathaniel replied gently. "But next time, seek help before resorting to theft. There are kitchens that feed those in need," after giving the boy directions to a charitable house. They continued their walk. "That was kind," Abigail said. "It was necessary," Nathaniel corrected. "No child should starve in a prosperous kingdom. Yet many do." "Yes," his expression hardened. "A failing I intend to address when I have the power to do so." Abigail studied him with new appreciation. "You truly care about these people. They are Westland," he said simply. "Without them, we're just a handful of nobles playing at importance." As they returned to their horses, Abigail realized she was seeing a side of her husband she hadn't imagined existed, a man of principle beneath the bitter prince she'd married. Meanwhile, in Queen Genevieve's chambers, Duke Bradford placed the medallion on a velvet cloth before her. "Where did you find this?" she demanded, not touching it. "Among the peasant girl's possessions," Bradford replied. "Do you recognize it?" "Of course," Genevieve's voice was hushed. "The royal seal of Silver Oak. But how would a commoner come to possess such a thing?" Bradford's face was grim. "Perhaps she's not the commoner we believed." "Explain." 20 years ago, when King James led the campaign against Silver Oak, the royal family was believed exterminated. Queen Alara, King Cedric, and their infant daughter. "So, the princess's body was never found," Bradford continued. "There were rumors of a loyal servant escaping with the child during the attack." Genevieve's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "You cannot possibly suggest." "The timing fits. Abigail's age, her unknown parentage, this medallion," Bradford pointed to the silver disc. "If she is Princess Abigail of Silver Oak, rightful heir to that kingdom, then my husband didn't just give his son a peasant bride," Genevieve finished. "He unknowingly restored the bloodline he tried to destroy." She laughed bitterly. "The irony would amuse me if it didn't threaten everything." "If proven, her claim to Silver Oak's lands would be legitimate," Bradford warned. "Lands that now form Westland's richest province." Genevieve's beautiful face hardened. "No one can know of this, especially not the king or Nathaniel." She picked up the medallion, studying it. "We must dispose of this, and perhaps its owner as well." "Carefully," Bradford cautioned. "If she is who we suspect, Royal blood still flows in her veins. Royal blood spills as easily as common, Genevieve replied coldly, as King James demonstrated in Silver Oak. In the corridor outside, an elderly servant paused, her aged ears having caught more than the Queen intended. Martha had served in the palace for 50 years, including the brief period when Princess Alara of Silver Oak had visited before her marriage. She remembered the princess's gentle smile and the distinctive medallion she always wore, identical to the one the Queen now held. Martha shuffled away, her heart pounding with a terrible revelation, and the memory of a promise made long ago to serve the truth. No matter the cost. Missing? Abigail's voice rose in panic. What do you mean, missing? She stood in her chambers, frantically searching through her belongings while her maid watched nervously. I've looked everywhere, Your Highness. Perhaps it fell during your ride yesterday. No, Abigail insisted. Abigail, upending a small jewelry box. I never wear it outside these rooms. It was here, in my leather pouch. She ran a hand through her hair, disheveling the careful arrangement her maid had just completed. That medallion is the only thing I have from my birth parents. A knock interrupted her search. Prince Nathaniel entered, dressed in formal attire for the upcoming banquet. You're not ready, he observed, then noticed her distress. What's happened? The maid curtsied and retreated as Abigail explained. A silver medallion with a tree design, Nathaniel asked, frowning. I'll have the guards search the palace. It's probably nothing to you, Abigail said. But it's everything to me. Something in her voice made him pause. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. In these past weeks, I've come to know you, Abigail. I understand what it means to cling to something that connects you to your past. He touched her shoulder briefly. I'll find it for you. The unexpected tenderness in his gesture sent warmth through her. Their relationship had evolved from hostile formality to something approaching friendship, perhaps even more, though neither dared acknowledge it. Thank you, she whispered. For now, we have duties to attend. The anniversary banquet can't proceed without the prince and his new princess. His lips quirked in a half-smile. Even a controversial one. The royal anniversary banquet commemorated King James's 30 years on the throne. Every noble family in Westland would attend, along with foreign dignitaries and allies. For Abigail, it represented her first major appearance as Princess of Westland. I'll never belong in that ballroom, she murmured, allowing her maid to resume dressing her. Neither do I, Nathaniel replied unexpectedly. Not truly. She glanced at him, surprised by the admission. We perform our roles, he continued, but that doesn't mean we become them. He moved to the window, looking out over the palace gardens. Perhaps that's why my father despises me. He became the crown completely, leaving nothing of the man behind. And you refuse to do the same, Abigail observed. He nodded, still facing the window. The man must guide the crown, not be consumed by it. A comfortable silence fell between them, as Abigail's maid finished securing her emerald green gown, the most elaborate she'd worn since her arrival. When she stood to face Nathaniel, his expression shifted to one of genuine admiration. You look, he paused, seeming to search for the right word. Royal, she laughed softly. A convincing costume then. Not a costume, he corrected. A revelation of what was already there, in her private chambers. Queen Genevieve carefully removed a small crystal vial from a hidden compartment in her jewelry box. The clear liquid inside caught the light as she handed it to her trusted lady-in-waiting. 3 drops in her wine, she instructed. No more. We want illness, not death. Not yet. Yes, Your Majesty, the woman replied, concealing the vial in her sleeve. And if someone else drinks from her cup, they'll suffer unfortunate digestive distress. Genevieve's smile was cold. Nothing fatal, simply humiliating. Duke Bradford entered through a hidden door, his usual confidence replaced with tension. The king has requested private words with the peasant princess before the banquet. Genevieve stiffened. Why? He doesn't share his reasons with me, Bradford replied sarcastically. But his interest in her grows troubling. My husband has always had an eye for pretty young things, Genevieve said bitterly. This is different. He questions her background, her parentage. Has he seen the medallion? No. I've secured it. Bradford paced the chamber. But something has piqued his curiosity. Then tonight's plan becomes even more crucial. Genevieve said. "Once she's ill, I'll suggest she's unfit for royal duties. Perhaps even carrying disease from her common origins. The court will shun her. And if the king protects her..." Genevieve's eyes hardened. "Then we accelerate our timeline." Martha, the elderly servant, moved through the palace corridors as quickly as her aging bones allowed. 50 years of service had made her nearly invisible to the nobles and guards, a shadow that drifted unnoticed along the walls. This invisibility had become her greatest asset. She'd spent 2 days confirming her suspicions after overhearing the queen's conversation. The medallion she glimpsed matched the one Princess Alara of Silver Oak had worn during her visit to Westland all those years ago, before King James had orchestrated the border dispute that led to Silver Oak's destruction. Martha had served Queen Helena, James's first wife, until her death in childbirth. Helena had been kind, tempering her husband's worst impulses, at least until Prince Nathaniel was born. After her death, James's cruelty had emerged unchecked. Now Martha clutched a small package wrapped in linen as she approached Prince Nathaniel's private study. She knocked tentatively. "Enter," called his voice. The prince looked up from his desk, surprise crossing his features. "Martha, what brings you here?" She curtsied painfully. "Forgiveness, Your Highness, for the intrusion, but there's something you must know before tonight's banquet." She unwrapped the package with trembling hands, revealing a silver medallion identical to Abigail's. "This belonged to Princess Alara of Silver Oak, who visited when I served your mother." Nathaniel's brow furrowed as he took the medallion. "Why bring this to me now?" "Because your wife carries its twin," Martha said. "Or did, until it was stolen from her chambers by the Duke of Bradford." Nathaniel's head snapped up. "How do you know this?" "Old servants hear much and are seen little," she replied. "The Queen and Duke believe Princess Abigail is the lost heir of Silver Oak, the infant princess who disappeared during your father's attack." "Attack," Nathaniel repeated, his voice sharp. "Silver Oak fell during a defensive campaign after they violated our borders." Martha's ancient eyes filled with tears. "Is that what you were told, my prince? There was no violation. Your father coveted Silver Oak's rich mines and forests. The attack was unprovoked, a midnight massacre disguised as retaliation." Nathaniel's face had gone pale. "These are dangerous accusations, Martha." "I'm 83 years old. Your Highness, what dangers can threaten me now?" Her gnarled hands clasped his. "The Queen plans to poison Princess Abigail tonight. Not to kill, not yet, but to begin undermining her position. You must protect her. Why would you risk yourself for Abigail?" "I failed to speak truth when your father attacked Silver Oak," Martha said quietly. "That silence cost thousands of lives. I won't fail again." After Martha departed, Nathaniel sat motionless, the medallion heavy in his hand. If Martha spoke truth, his father's legacy, and his own inheritance, was built on treachery and innocent blood, and Abigail. The implications staggered him. His punishment bride might be the rightful ruler of lands his father had stolen through violence. Even more troubling was the realization that his feelings for Abigail had grown beyond duty or friendship. The thought of her being harmed awakened a protective fury he'd never experienced. The grand ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles as nobility from across Westland gathered to celebrate their king. Abigail entered on Nathaniel's arm, acutely aware of the assessing gazes and whispered comments that followed them. "Ignore them," Nathaniel murmured. "Remember what I told you. You belong here as much as anyone." Before they could reach their assigned seats, a royal herald intercepted them. His Majesty requests Princess Abigail's presence in the antechamber before the formal proceedings. Nathaniel frowned. "I'll accompany her. Alone, Your Highness," the herald clarified. The king was most specific. Abigail felt Nathaniel's arm tense beneath her hand. "It's all right," she assured him. "I can manage your father for a few minutes. Be careful what you say," he warned, his voice unexpectedly urgent. "And Abigail, don't drink anything offered to you tonight. By anyone." She blinked in confusion. "What?" "Trust me," he interrupted. "I'll explain later." The antechamber was small, but opulent, with tapestries depicting Westland's military victories. King James stood alone by the fireplace, studying her as she entered. "Your Majesty," Abigail curtsied deeply. "You wish to see me." "Come closer, girl," he commanded. "Let me look at you properly." She approached cautiously, though aging, The king remained imposing, broad-shouldered and stern, with calculating eyes that seemed to dissect her. "You've adapted well to court life," he observed. "Better than I anticipated. Thank you, Your Majesty. You remind me of someone," he continued, circling her slowly. "Something in your eyes, perhaps. Your parents. Your real parents, not the farmers. Who were they?" Abigail's heart stuttered. "I never knew them. Sire, I was found as an infant." "Found where, exactly?" "Near the eastern border, I was told, after some conflict." She chose her words carefully, suddenly fearful of revealing too much. The king's eyes narrowed. "What year?" 20 years ago this summer." Something flashed across the king's face. Recognition. Perhaps, or alarm. He recovered quickly. An interesting coincidence. That summer saw the fall of Silver Oak, a minor kingdom that once bordered our eastern provinces. "I wouldn't know of such matters, Your Majesty." "No," he agreed. "You wouldn't." He reached out suddenly, tilting her chin up. "Yet here you stand. A simple farmer raised a princess, married to my son who now looks at you with genuine affection." His laugh held no humor. "The gods have a perverse sense of justice." Before she could respond, he released her. "Go, join your husband and princess." He paused, studying her with unreadable eyes. "Watch your wine tonight. Not everyone celebrates your rise." Abigail returned to the banquet hall in a daze, the king's cryptic warning echoing in her mind. She found Nathaniel scanning the crowd anxiously, his face relaxing only when he spotted her. "What did my father want?" he asked quietly, as she took her seat beside him. "He asked about my parents, my birth parents," she whispered, "and he mentioned Silver Oak." Nathaniel's hand tightened around his goblet. "We need to talk, not here." The banquet proceeded with lavish ceremony. Course after course arrived while musicians played and courtiers engaged in the elaborate dance of politics. Queen Genevieve presided at the king's side, her beauty enhanced by an elaborate gown of midnight blue and a diamond tiara. She raised her goblet in a toast to her husband's 30 years of glorious rule. Throughout the evening, Abigail noticed the queen's lady-in-waiting hovering near their table, heeding both Nathaniel's and the king's warnings. She left her wine untouched and watched her food carefully. "You're not drinking," observed Lord Harmond, an elderly noble seated across from her. "Is our local vintage not to your taste, princess?" "I find wine makes my thoughts fuzzy," Abigail replied diplomatically. "And tonight, I wish to remember every detail of this magnificent celebration," the lord chuckled. "Wise for one so young, most at court drink precisely to forget the tedious details." When the feasting concluded, the assembly moved to the grand ballroom for dancing. Nathaniel drew Abigail into a quiet alcove behind a marble pillar. "I need to show you something," he said, pressing a cool metal object into her palm. Abigail gasped. "My medallion. How did you—" "It's not yours," he interrupted. "Look closely." She examined it in the candlelight. Though nearly identical to her own, subtle differences marked this as a different piece. The tree had 7 branches instead of 6, and the script along the outer edge varied slightly. "I don't understand. Martha, an old servant who attended my mother, brought this to me today. It belonged to Princess Alara of Silver Oak." Nathaniel's eyes searched hers. "She believes your medallion is its twin, part of a matched set worn by the royal family." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. "What are you saying?" "Martha thinks, and I believe she may be right, that you are the lost princess of Silver Oak." He guided her further into the shadows. "The infant daughter of King Cedric and Queen Alara was never found after my father's forces took the castle." "Your father's forces," Abigail repeated numbly. "I thought Silver Oak fell in some border conflict." Bitterness crossed Nathaniel's face. "So did I. Until today, Martha claims it was an unprovoked attack, a midnight massacre to seize Silver Oak's resources." The revelation struck Abigail like a physical blow. "That can't be true if I were this princess. Surely someone would have recognized me before now. The attack was 20 years ago. Few from Silver Oak survive, and those who do wouldn't have access to the royal court." He held up the medallion. "This is why the Queen plots against you. She and Duke Bradford discovered your medallion and recognized its significance." The orchestra began a stately pavane, covering their whispered conversation. "This is madness," Abigail insisted. "I'm a farmer's daughter, not a princess." You were raised by farmers, Nathaniel corrected. Found as an infant near the eastern border, Silver Oak's former territory, with only this medallion as a clue to your origins. The pieces started falling into terrible place. The king's strange questions. His recognition when she mentioned being found 20 years ago. His warning about her wine. If this is true, she said slowly, your father murdered my parents and stole my kingdom. Nathaniel nodded grimly. And 20 years later, in a cruel twist of fate, he unknowingly married his son to the very bloodline he tried to exterminate. Abigail leaned against the pillar. Overwhelmed. What do we do with this knowledge? First, we find proof beyond these medallions. If your heritage is legitimate, it changes everything. His eyes met hers. The lands that once formed Silver Oak are now Westland's richest province. Your claim would be valid under ancient law. I don't want lands or titles, Abigail said fiercely. I want the truth about who I am and what happened to my family. The truth may be our most powerful weapon, Nathaniel agreed, but also the most dangerous to seek. A shadow fell across them as Duke Bradford approached. His thin lips curved in a false smile. Your Highnesses? He bowed. The Queen requests Princess Abigail's company among the ladies. It's inappropriate for the princess to seclude herself with her husband at her first royal function. The implied criticism was clear. Another attempt to paint Abigail as ignorant of court protocol. Of course, she replied smoothly. Years of managing marketplace negotiations serving her well. I was just telling Prince Nathaniel how much I admire the Queen's diamond tiara. Is it a family heirloom, Duke Bradford? The Duke's smile faltered slightly. Her Majesty's jewels are her private concern, Princess. Curious. I thought everything in Westland was the King's concern. Abigail countered, watching confusion flicker across Bradford's face, including missing items from royal guests' chambers. Nathaniel placed a protective hand on her back. My wife refers to a personal medallion that disappeared from her rooms. Silver, with a distinctive tree design. Perhaps you've seen it, Duke. Bradford's face remained impassive, but his eyes hardened. I regret I cannot help with such a trivial matter. If you'll excuse me, Princess. The Queen awaits, as Bradford escorted her across the ballroom. Abigail felt Nathaniel's eyes following them. The knowledge he'd shared hummed like live current beneath her skin. Princess of Silver Oak, her entire identity, her very understanding of herself, had been built on incomplete truths. That night, after returning to her chambers, Abigail found herself unable to sleep. She paced before the fireplace, her mind racing with implications. If she truly was Silver Oak's heir, what did that mean for her future? For her increasingly complex feelings toward Nathaniel? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Nathaniel, still dressed in his formal attire but looking haggard. I've been researching in the royal archives, he said, without preamble, entering with an armful of scrolls. Most records of Silver Oak were destroyed after its fall, but I found these. He spread several maps and documents on her table. One showed the boundaries of Westland 20 years earlier, significantly smaller, with Silver Oak occupying the eastern forests and mountains. This region now produces half of Westland's timber and nearly all its silver, Nathaniel explained. It's the foundation of my father's wealth and power. Another document caught Abigail's eye. A portrait sketch of a woman with a striking resemblance to her own reflection. Queen Alara, Nathaniel confirmed softly. Your mother, if Martha is correct. Abigail touched the drawing with trembling fingers. The woman had the same wide-set eyes, the same curve to her mouth. She looks kind. By all accounts, she was. Beloved by her people and known for her wisdom. He hesitated. There's something else. He unrolled a final scroll, a faded battle map marked with troop positions. This details my father's defensive response to Silver Oak's supposed aggression. His voice was bitter. Except the dates are wrong. His forces were positioned for attack 3 days before the alleged border violation. This wasn't retaliation. It was a planned conquest disguised as justified warfare. Abigail stared at the evidence of calculated treachery. All those people, my people, died for a lie. My father's entire reign is built on such lies, Nathaniel said, his voice hollow. I've been blind to it, or perhaps willfully ignorant. Their eyes met across the table, the weight of revelation heavy between them. What do we do? Abigail asked again. I don't know, he admitted. Revealing this now would cause chaos. The noble houses who supported my father's campaign might turn against him, or unite to silence us. The king still commands the army's loyalty. So we do nothing. Her voice rose with indignation. Allow your father's crimes to remain buried. No. Nathaniel's expression hardened with resolve. We gather more evidence, build a case that cannot be dismissed as rumor or treasonous fabrication. Then we present it not just to Westland's court, but to representatives of other kingdoms, witnesses who cannot be silenced. That could take months. Yes, and we must proceed carefully. The queen already moves against you, and if my father suspects what we know, he left the threat unspoken. Abigail suddenly felt the exhaustion of the day's revelations. She sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the weight of a heritage she never knew she carried. Nathaniel knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. I know this is a burden you never asked for. If you wish to flee, return to your orchard or seek asylum in another kingdom, I would understand. I would help you. Abigail studied his face, the face of the man who had begun as her jailer and somehow become her ally. Perhaps something more. And you, she asked softly, what would you do if I left? Continue seeking justice, he replied without hesitation. My father's crimes are my inheritance as surely as his crown. I cannot ignore that responsibility. In that moment, Abigail recognized something in Nathaniel that mirrored her own heart, a determination to face difficult truths, no matter the cost. Then we proceed together, she decided. Princess or farmer, I cannot turn away from this truth either. Nathaniel's hands tightened around hers, his voice dropping to a whisper. Whatever comes, know this. Our marriage may have begun as punishment, but meeting you has been the greatest gift of my life. The Grand Council chamber buzzed with anticipation. 2 months had passed since the anniversary banquet, and today King James would welcome ambassadors from 7 neighboring kingdoms. The event was ostensibly to celebrate trade agreements, but everyone understood its true purpose. A display of Westland's power and prosperity. Abigail stood before her mirror as maids secured her royal blue gown. She barely recognized herself anymore. The simple orchard girl transformed into a poised princess who now understood the deadly games of court politics. You look troubled, Your Highness, observed her most trusted maid, Lily. Just thinking of all that's happened, Abigail replied carefully. Few knew of her and Nathaniel's secret investigation into her heritage and the king's crimes. Over the past months, they had assembled damning evidence. Financial records showing Silver Oak's wealth funneled into Westland's treasury, correspondence revealing the king's premeditated attack, and testimonies from displaced Silver Oak citizens who had recognized Abigail's medallion when she ventured into the city. Most crucially, they had located the midwife who attended Queen Alara's birth. Now an elderly herbalist living anonymously in the capital, she had confirmed the distinctive birthmark on Abigail's shoulder matched the infant princess's. Prince Nathaniel entered, dismissing the other maids with a gesture. When they were alone, his formal demeanor dissolved. Everything is prepared, he said quietly. The representatives from the artisan and merchant guilds are already seated among the guests, as are delegates from the eastern provinces, former Silver Oak territories. This had been Nathaniel's most radical decision, to invite common citizens to the royal banquet alongside nobility and foreign dignitaries. The king had reluctantly agreed, seeing it as his son's attempt to establish popularity among the lower classes. And the documents, Abigail asked, hidden with trusted allies throughout the room. If anything happens to us, the truth will still emerge. His face was grim. Once we begin, there's no turning back. The king's retaliation will be swift. We've discussed this, Abigail reminded him. Justice delayed is justice denied. Your father's victims deserve the truth, and Westland deserves a ruler who governs with honesty. Nathaniel took her hands. Over these past months, their relationship had deepened into something neither had anticipated. Genuine love forged through shared purpose and growing respect. I never thought I'd say this to the bride my father forced upon me, he said softly, but I could not do this without you, Abigail. Your courage gives me strength. She squeezed his hands, and your principles gave me hope when I had none. She reached beneath her bodice, withdrawing both medallions, hers and Princess Alara's, now threaded on the same chain. Whatever happens tonight, we face it together. Their plan was bold, perhaps foolhardy. publicly reveal King James's crimes before witnesses from 7 kingdoms, leaving him no opportunity to silence the accusations. The risk was enormous, but so was the potential reward: justice for Silver Oak and a new beginning for Westland. As they prepared to descend to the banquet, Martha appeared at their door, her ancient face lined with worry. "The Queen knows," she whispered urgently. "Bradford has been searching the archives. They suspect what you plan to do tonight." Nathaniel's expression hardened. "Then we must move more quickly than anticipated." The great hall had been transformed for the diplomatic banquet. Long tables arranged in a square formation seated over 200 guests, the largest royal gathering in years. Tapestries depicting Westland's military victories hung from the walls, including one showing Silver Oak's fall, tactfully renamed the Eastern Campaign. King James presided at the head table, resplendent in military regalia. Despite his increasingly frail health, Queen Genevieve sat beside him, her beauty enhanced by an emerald gown that matched her calculating eyes. She watched Abigail and Nathaniel's entrance with barely concealed suspicion. As tradition dictated, the first hour was dedicated to formal introductions and diplomatic pleasantries. Servants poured wine and presented elaborately prepared dishes while musicians played softly in the gallery above. Abigail noticed Queen Genevieve whispering instructions to her lady-in-waiting, who then approached their table with a special goblet. "The Queen sends her personal vintage for Princess Abigail," the woman announced loudly enough for nearby diplomats to hear. A gesture of royal favor. It was a masterful trap. Refusing would insult the Queen publicly. Accepting risked poison, Nathaniel intercepted the goblet. "How thoughtful. My wife and I shall share this honor." He raised the cup to his lips but did not drink, instead using the moment to signal their allies around the room. Then he set it down untouched as the main course concluded. King James rose to deliver his address. "Honored guests, noble lords, representatives of our allied kingdoms, today we celebrate Westland's prosperity and the peace our strength has secured," he continued with practiced eloquence, recounting his 30-year reign as a series of triumphs and wise decisions, conveniently omitting the bloodshed that had accompanied his expansion. "With pride, I look to the future, to my son, Prince Nathaniel, who will one day continue our legacy of strength and honor." This was the moment they had planned for. As customary, the prince would respond with gratitude and loyalty. Nathaniel rose slowly, his face a careful mask. "Thank you, Father, for those kind words." His voice carried clearly through the hushed hall. "Indeed, legacy is much on my mind lately. What we inherit, what we pass on, and the truth that must accompany both." A subtle shift in atmosphere rippled through the room. This was not the expected response. "Today, before our honored guests and citizens, I must address that truth." Nathaniel withdrew a scroll from his tunic. "This document, bearing the royal seal of Westland, orders an unprovoked attack on the sovereign kingdom of Silver Oak 20 years ago. Not a defensive action as our people were told, but a calculated conquest for territory and resources." Gasps and murmurs erupted around the tables. The king's face darkened with fury. "Enough," he thundered. "You dishonor yourself and your kingdom with these wild accusations." Nathaniel continued calmly. "Not accusations, Father. Documented facts, supported by financial records, military orders, and witness testimony." He gestured to Abigail, who rose beside him, the dual medallions now visible around her neck. "I present to you Princess Abigail of House Silver Oak, rightful heir to the kingdom destroyed by Westland's armies, the infant princess believed lost during the Midnight Massacre, saved by loyal servants and raised in obscurity." The hall erupted in chaos. Queen Genevieve half rose, her face contorted with rage. While Duke Bradford signaled to guards positioned around the room, King James slammed his fist on the table. "Arrest them both for treason." But the guards hesitated, uncertain. Several Eastern nobility, former Silver Oak citizens, had risen in support of Nathaniel's claims. Abigail stepped forward, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I do not stand before you seeking vengeance or division. I stand for truth, the foundation of any just kingdom." From around the room, their allies rose, merchants, guild representatives, Eastern nobles, each holding copies of the evidence Nathaniel and Abigail had gathered. "The documents have been distributed to every kingdom represented here," Nathaniel announced. "The truth of Silver Oak's fall will be known. regardless of what happens in this hall tonight. King James's face had gone deathly pale. His breathing labored as rage and shock overtook him. You would betray your father. Your bloodline for this farmer. Not for her, Nathaniel replied firmly. For justice. For the people of Westland who deserve better than rule built on deception. He turned to face the assembled guests. I hereby renounce my claim to the throne of Westland, refusing to inherit a crown tainted by innocent blood. The statement sent another shockwave through the hall. Even Abigail had not expected this final move. In the sudden silence that followed, Queen Genevieve saw opportunity. She rose gracefully, her voice dripping with false concern. My esteemed guests, you witnessed the tragic result of a commoner's influence on royal blood. My stepson has clearly been bewitched by this pretender. She placed a protective hand on her young son. Seated beside her, fortunately Westland has another heir, pure of blood and untainted by treasonous thoughts. Before anyone could respond, Martha pushed through the crowd, her frail body somehow commanding attention. Bewitched, Your Majesty. The old woman's voice was surprisingly strong. Is that what you call truth-telling now? Tell us. Is it bewitchment that made you plan to poison Princess Abigail at the anniversary banquet? Is it bewitchment that drives your secret meetings with Duke Bradford, plotting to secure the throne for your son while your husband still wears the crown? Queen Genevieve's perfect composure cracked. How dare you, you interfering hag! Guards, remove this servant! But Bradford, sensing the shifting tide, stepped away from the queen, self-preservation overriding loyalty. The king, watching his carefully constructed world crumble, suddenly clutched his chest, his face contorted with pain as he collapsed into his chair. Father. Nathaniel rushed to his side, personal grievances momentarily forgotten. As physicians hurried forward and the hall descended into pandemonium, Abigail found herself standing alone in the center of a storm she had helped create. The medallions felt heavy against her skin, the weight of a heritage reclaimed and a future uncertain. Dawn broke over a palace transformed. King James lay in his royal chambers, alive but weakened by what the physicians called an affliction of the heart. Guards loyal to different factions patrolled the corridors, eyeing each other with suspicion. Nobles who had pledged allegiance to the king now gathered in whispered clusters. Calculating where to place their support in the uncertain days ahead, Abigail stood at the window of the council chamber, watching the city awaken. Behind her, Nathaniel conferred with representatives from the eastern provinces, former Silver Oak territories, who had remained through the night. You've lived your entire life as Abigail Foster, said Lord Thane, the eldest of the group. Yet you carry the blood of Silver Oak's royal line. The question remains, what do you intend to do with this heritage? Abigail turned to face them. I seek justice, not power. The people of Silver Oak deserve recognition of the wrongs committed against them, but I have no desire to fragment Westland or incite civil war. Noble sentiments? A merchant representative commented. But the situation demands more than sentiment. The king is incapacitated. The queen has retreated to her chambers with her personal guards. Duke Bradford has reportedly fled the capital. Someone must lead. Nathaniel joined them, his face drawn from lack of sleep. The Council of Nobles convenes at midday. Traditionally, they would confirm me as regent until my father recovers or passes. His voice caught slightly on the last word. Despite everything, James was still his father. Will they support you after last night's revelations? Asked Lady Melina, another Eastern noble. Some will, some won't, Nathaniel replied honestly. The court is divided. Those loyal to my father, those who support the queen and her son, those who see opportunity in chaos, and those who believe in the truth you revealed. Abigail added quietly. A messenger entered, bowing hastily. Your Highnesses, there's a situation in the city square. They rushed to the eastern balcony, which overlooked the main thoroughfare leading to the palace gates. What they saw stole their breath. Thousands of citizens had gathered, their numbers growing by the minute. Market vendors, craftspeople, farmers from outlying areas, and common laborers stood shoulder to shoulder with merchants and minor nobility. Many carried makeshift banners displaying a silver tree on a blue field, the emblem of Silver Oak that had been forbidden for 2 decades. News of the previous night's revelations had spread like wildfire through the capital. This is unprecedented, whispered Lord Thane. The common folk rarely involve themselves in matters of royal succession. Perhaps it's time they did, Abigail replied, a new resolution forming within her. Nathaniel, what if we addressed them directly, not as princes and princesses speaking down to subjects, but as leaders seeking true partnership with those we would govern? Nathaniel studied her face, understanding dawning in his eyes. A radical approach, but these are radical times. Within the hour, they had descended to the palace gates. The royal guard commander, a veteran who had served under King James for decades, approached them anxiously. Your Highnesses, I cannot guarantee your safety beyond these walls. The crowd is not hostile yet, but emotions run high. They are citizens, not enemies, Nathaniel replied firmly. Open the gates. But sire, open them, Abigail echoed, or they'll believe we fear them as King James did. The massive iron gates swung slowly outward. A hush fell over the assembled crowd as Nathaniel and Abigail stepped through, accompanied by only 4 guards and the representatives who had supported them. For a breathless moment, no one moved. Then, from the back of the crowd, someone called out, "Princess Silver Oak!" Others took up the cry, voices merging into a thunderous chant. Abigail raised her hands, and gradually silence returned. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the square. I stand before you not just as Princess of Silver Oak or Princess of Westland, but as someone who has lived among you. I've worked the soil, counted pennies for taxes, and known hunger in lean years. She touched the medallions at her throat. This heritage I've discovered doesn't separate me from you. It connects me to a legacy of rulers who served their people rather than ruling over them. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Last night, truth was spoken in the palace for the first time in decades, she continued. The conquest of Silver Oak was not a defensive action, but a calculated seizure of land and resources. My birth parents and thousands of innocent people died not for security but for profit. Anger flashed across many faces, not directed at her, but at the decades of deception. Nathaniel stepped forward. I renounced my claim to the throne because I cannot in good conscience inherit a crown tainted by such crimes. But renunciation alone solves nothing. Westland needs leadership, not to continue my father's legacy of conquest, but to forge a new path of justice and shared prosperity. An elderly man pushed to the front. His weathered face marked him as a laborer, but he spoke with dignity. Pretty words, Your Highness. We've heard pretty words before. What exactly do you propose? A Council of Commons, Abigail answered before Nathaniel could speak. Representatives chosen from all parts of society. Farmers, merchants, artisans, soldiers, and yes, nobility, to govern alongside the crown. No major decision affecting the kingdom would be made without this council's input. Astonished murmurs spread through the crowd. Such an arrangement was unheard of in any neighboring realm. And who would wear the crown in this new Westland? Someone called out. Nathaniel looked at Abigail, a question in his eyes. They had discussed many possibilities through the night, but reached no firm conclusion. She stepped closer to him, taking his hand publicly, a gesture that caused another ripple of reaction. Prince Nathaniel has proven his commitment to truth and justice. Even at great personal cost, I believe he would serve honorably as king, if the people will have him. And you as his queen? Asked Lady Melina. Yes, Abigail replied simply. Not because of our arranged marriage, but because we have chosen each other freely, having seen the best and worst in one another. The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming. Cheers erupted from thousands of throats. While many had doubts about the specifics of this radical proposal, the honesty and directness with which it was presented stood in stark contrast to decades of royal manipulation. As the day progressed, the gathering in the square transformed from a potential uprising into something unprecedented. A peaceful assembly where citizens of all classes voiced their grievances and hopes directly to their future rulers. Scribes recorded the concerns while Nathaniel and Abigail listened, occasionally conferring with advisors about how specific issues might be addressed. By sunset, messengers reported similar gatherings in other major towns across Westland. The story of Silver Oak's fall and Abigail's true identity had spread with remarkable speed, along with news of Nathaniel's renunciation and their joint proposal for a new form of governance. Inside the palace, the Queen had not been idle. With Duke Bradford gone, She had rallied supporters among nobles who feared losing power to common citizens. As Nathaniel and Abigail returned from the square, they were met by Lord Chancellor Blackwood, the realm's highest judicial officer. "The Queen Regent demands your immediate presence," he announced stiffly. "Queen Regent," Nathaniel echoed in disbelief. "By whose authority?" "By order of the Royal Council." "In the King's incapacitation," Blackwood replied. "The Queen Mother's regency will continue until Prince Edmund reaches maturity." "The Council cannot appoint a regent without hearing all legitimate claimants," Lord Thane objected. "That's ancient law." "The Council has deemed Prince Nathaniel's renunciation of his claim as binding," Blackwood countered smugly. "And as for any alternative claimants, their legitimacy remains unproven." Abigail stepped forward. "Then let us prove it. I will submit to any test the Council requires to establish my heritage." "That won't be necessary," came a weak voice from behind them. King James stood in the corridor, supported by his physician but unmistakably alert. His face was ashen, his breathing labored, but his eyes burned with their familiar intensity. "Father," Nathaniel said, surprised, "you should be resting." "To what end?" "So Genevieve can arrange my permanent rest." The king's laugh turned into a painful cough. "I've heard enough through my chamber walls to understand the game she plays." He gestured for them to follow him to his private study. Once inside, he dismissed all attendants except Abigail and Nathaniel. "So," he said, lowering himself carefully into a chair, "Silver Oak's lost princess returns to claim her birthright, and my son rejects his inheritance to stand with her." His expression was unreadable. "A fitting punishment for an old king's crimes." Nathaniel stared at his father. "You admit them, then? The unprovoked attack, the lies told to justify it." "I admit nothing and everything," James replied cryptically. "But I recognize defeat when it surrounds me." He turned his gaze to Abigail. "You have your mother's eyes. I should have seen it sooner." Outside the study, the sound of marching feet echoed through the corridor, the Queen's guards mobilizing for what might become the first battle in a civil war. 3 days of tense negotiations followed, with the palace divided between forces loyal to the Queen and those supporting Nathaniel and Abigail. Civil war seemed inevitable, until King James himself intervened in a move that shocked the entire kingdom. Leaning heavily on a ceremonial staff, the ailing monarch entered the great hall where the divided council had gathered. Behind him walked Nathaniel and Abigail, flanked by representatives from both noble houses and common citizens. "My loyal subjects," James began, his voice weaker than anyone remembered, but still commanding. "I have ruled Westland for 3 decades, expanding our borders and strengthening our position among nations. But all reigns must end." A murmur rippled through the hall. "I hereby abdicate the throne of Westland," he announced. The murmur became a roar of astonishment, not under coercion but by choice, having seen the future approaching with or without my blessing. Queen Genevieve rose from her seat, her face a mask of calculated concern. "Your Majesty, in your weakened state—" "Silence," James commanded with a flash of his old authority. "Your scheming ends today, Genevieve. Your son will be provided for as befits royal blood, but he will not inherit my crown." He turned to address the full assembly. "I acknowledge before all witnesses the crimes committed during the conquest of Silver Oak. I further acknowledge Princess Abigail as the rightful heir to that kingdom, which was unjustly absorbed into Westland." Those from the eastern provinces openly wept at this long-awaited admission. "As my final royal act," James continued, "I decree the restoration of Silver Oak as a sovereign nation, with Princess Abigail as its rightful queen." Abigail stepped forward, visibly moved. "I accept this restoration, not for power, but for justice, however," she added, scanning the faces before her. "I propose not separation, but union, a new beginning where Silver Oak and Westland become partner kingdoms under joint rule." Nathaniel joined her. "Together, we envision one realm with 2 traditions, governed not by conquest, but by covenant between crown and citizens." The proposal was radical, but after days of fearing bloodshed, the assembly received it with cautious hope. Arrangements were made for a formal coronation and the drafting of a new charter establishing the Council of Commons. Queen Genevieve, seeing her path to power dissolve, attempted one final desperate move, As the assembly dispersed, her loyal guards surrounded her and young Prince Edmund, drawing weapons as they retreated toward the treasury. Their plan, to flee with as much royal wealth as they could carry, was thwarted when they found Duke Bradford had beaten them to it. The treasury doors stood open, key coffers already emptied. Captain Garrison of the Royal Guard, who had quietly shifted his loyalty to Nathaniel days earlier, intercepted the fleeing party at the palace's eastern gate. Genevieve and Bradford were separately captured, their respective betrayals of each other providing the final dramatic chapter to their ill-fated alliance. 1 year later, the United Kingdoms of Westland, Silver Oak celebrated their first anniversary under new leadership. The palace, once a fortress of exclusion, had been partially opened to the public. The Great Hall now hosted not only nobility, but representatives from every province and profession. King Nathaniel and Queen Abigail had proven themselves dedicated to their radical vision. The Council of Commons, while still finding its voice, had already implemented reforms that eased taxation on farmers, established schools in rural areas, and created a system where citizens could petition directly for redress of grievances. Former Queen Genevieve and Duke Bradford had been sentenced not to execution, as traditional justice might have demanded, but to years of service establishing hospitals and schools in the Western Territories, using their considerable talents for organization and persuasion toward constructive ends under careful supervision. As for former King James, his punishment had been both more subtle and more profound. Stripped of title and power, he had chosen exile to the ruins of Silver Oak's royal palace. There, with a small staff and modest accommodations, he worked alongside reconstruction crews rebuilding what he had once destroyed. On a crisp autumn day, Abigail's carriage wound through the forested hills of eastern Silver Oak. A year of queenship had changed her. She carried herself with natural authority now, though she still preferred simpler gowns than court fashion dictated. At her throat, she wore only one medallion now, her original, the other having been buried with King James's formal abdication document as a symbol of reconciliation. The carriage stopped before partially rebuilt walls. What had once been Silver Oak's proud royal palace was now a construction site, though portions had been restored with remarkable faithfulness to their original design. "Are you certain you wish to see him alone?" asked her guard captain. "Yes," Abigail replied. "Some conversations require privacy." She found the former king in what had once been the palace orchards, now just cleared land with newly planted saplings in neat rows. James knelt in the soil, his once regal hands dirty from work. He seemed smaller somehow, his imposing presence diminished by simple clothing and honest labor. He looked up at her approach, shielding his eyes against the sun. "Queen Abigail," he acknowledged, making no move to rise. "Have you come to ensure your father-in-law isn't plotting rebellion from his exile?" "I've come to see how you fare," she replied simply. "And to ask a question?" James gestured to a rough-hewn bench nearby. Once they were seated, he waited expectantly. "Why apple trees?" Abigail asked, indicating the saplings. "Of all things you could plant here?" A faint smile crossed his weathered face. "Apple trees take years to mature, decades to reach full production." He looked across the young orchard. "I won't live to see these trees bear their best fruit. There's a humility in planting something whose full benefit belongs to future generations." Abigail studied him. "You've changed. Loss has a way of clarifying perspective," he replied. "Power, conquest, legacy, they seemed so important. Now I find meaning in watching things grow rather than in tearing them down." They sat in silence for a moment, the autumn breeze rustling through nearby woods. "Nathaniel has your determination," James observed eventually. "But thankfully, he has his mother's wisdom as well. He speaks of you sometimes," Abigail said. "Not the king you were, but the father you could have been." James nodded slowly. "Another orchard I failed to properly tend." He turned to face her directly. "You've done well, you and Nathaniel. The reports I receive suggest Westland Silver Oak prospers under your joint rule. We have much still to accomplish," Abigail replied. "The council functions, but true partnership between classes will take generations to fully realize." "Yet you've begun it," James said. "Sometimes beginning is the hardest part." He gestured to the rebuilt sections of the palace. "When I arrived, this was rubble and ghosts. Now at least it has foundations again." As Abigail prepared to leave, James walked her to her carriage. At the last moment, he spoke again. his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I did not apologize well when I abdicated. Politics and pride interfered." He looked directly into her eyes. "I am sorry, Abigail of Silver Oak, for what I took from you. Your parents were good people who deserve better than the fate I dealt them." Abigail felt unexpected tears threaten. "Thank you," she managed. "I believe they would value that acknowledgement, even coming so late." On the journey home, Abigail reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. From simple orchard girl, to reluctant princess, to willing queen, none of it following any path she could have imagined. Nathaniel met her at the palace gates, concern in his eyes. How was he? "Changed," she replied thoughtfully. "Perhaps even healing." "And you?" he asked, taking her hand as they walked through the gardens where citizens now strolled freely certain days each month. "Also healing," she admitted. "Some wounds may never fully close, but they've begun to transform into something useful, like scars that remind us where we've been and what matters most." That evening, as they sat in their private chambers reviewing petitions from the council, Nathaniel paused to watch Abigail. The firelight caught the silver medallion at her throat, the tree symbol gleaming. "What are you thinking?" she asked, noticing his gaze. "That your parents would be proud of what you've built from the ashes of their kingdom," he replied. "And that I remain astonished daily by the twist of fate that brought you to me, even through my father's cruelty." Abigail smiled, touching the medallion. "Perhaps not fate alone," she said. "Perhaps also the choices we made when confronted with difficult truths." Outside their window, the capital city spread before them. Lights twinkling in homes and shops. Not a perfect kingdom yet, but one moving steadily toward justice, built not on conquest, but on the most powerful foundations of all: truth acknowledged, wrongs righted, and love freely chosen rather than commanded. After all, as Abigail had learned in her mother's orchard so long ago, the strongest trees grow not from force but from careful tending, patience, and the wisdom to recognize that the most important fruits often take the longest to ripen.